Well, good afternoon in Victoria and other parts of Canada. Welcome to the first IPAC Victoria webinar of 2023. Today our topic is wines, ports, airports, and much more, policy success in BC and Canada. My name is Everett Lindquist, and interestingly enough, I'm joining you from Tel Aviv, Israel. Today, I'll be facilitating this webinar for IPAC Victoria, which is an association of public servants from all levels of government, and that includes scholars and students interested in promoting public service excellence. Well, let's see. Today, our speakers, Lisa Helps, George Abbott, Mike Prince, and Kim Spears will be joining you this afternoon from the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples, whose connections with these lands continue to this day. And here we're thinking of the WSÁNEĆ, Songhees, Esquimalt, and Malahat nations. So why policy success? And the reason for this is that we tend to think of government and public policy as failures. When we turn on the TV, when we read the newspaper, we often hear about the latest failure of government or the purported failure of government. And of course, this is in part of our democratic system. In democracies, we invite politicians and the public and various interest groups to criticize the government of the day, point out failures and errors in order to bring attention to them and get something done about them. And of course, once we've learned about failures, then we can adapt our public policies and move forward. But one of the challenges with this, of course, is that we begin to think that government can't do anything right. And we take for granted the many good things that governments do and the many productive and positive public policies that have been put in place. Paul Tahart, who is a colleague at the University of Utrecht, has been part of led a group of scholars, been quite interested in redressing this balance in our public discourse about policy failure, and has made a concerted effort to draw together colleagues to think about and identify different cases of policy success in different jurisdictions. So on this slide, you'll see the first collection, Great Policy Successes, which includes cases from several different countries. But then he's moved on to encourage scholars in other countries, such as Australia and New Zealand, here in Canada, and also in the Nordic countries, to invite practitioners and academics to identify instances of policy success. And so today we're sort of in some ways celebrating the collection Policy Success in Canada. And you'll see the arrow on this page kind of pointing to this collection, which I had the privilege of co-editing with a number of other colleagues. And what you'll see there is that we have 22 cases of policy success in Canada. And as we discuss later, all policy success is certainly contested at different points in time, and they all go through phases of development. It's an interesting process that led to these 22 cases. We had about well over 100 contenders, which were suggested to us. And in the end, we wound up filtering out a great number of those cases and settled on, for the most part, national policy cases, realizing that we could have filled 3 or 4 more collections with regional and provincial and local case studies. And that's what we're going to be doing today, is turning to our colleagues to talk about some local and regional and provincial case studies from British Columbia, but also perhaps at the national level. So let me say just a few words about how we went about thinking about gauging policy success. What might be the criteria for that? I'm not going to go through this slide and take a long time, but effectively there were 4 areas. One is, was there a programmatic success? Was there a policy design or program that was effective, that actually worked, did what it set out to do? Second criteria would be, was it a good process success? did it engage various stakeholders, experts, maybe other levels of government in order to arrive at the policy? And finally, and thirdly, was it a political success? Did the government earn a good reputation for this? Did perhaps a political leader or a government get out in front of where public opinion was? Did a government, by putting this policy in place, win the next election? And finally, is a policy enduring? So there are lots of policies that are tried, but many don't last. And so that's another thing that we look for is, was there success over time? And success sometimes can grow over time. Policies can get off to a slow start and then gather steam, go through different phases of development. So those were the four general criteria. Now, this will be an overwhelming slide, of course, but the key thing here to understand is each of those criteria can be thought of as dimensions, ranging from failure to an outright success. And one of the really interesting things in pulling together our cases, and I'm sure we'll hear this from our colleagues on the panel today, is that some policies that we have in mind may be stronger along one of these dimensions. They may be a really good program that was put in place, but be less popular, or perhaps was not a political winner, and so on. And sometimes these different criteria can be in contention with one another. Here we have the four cases that were in the title of this suggestion. Sorry, I just have something in the way of my slide here. But the first one is the wine industry. And you can see here, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to give you an example, sort of the timeframes for success. We take for granted that we have well over 750 wineries now in BC, Ontario, and elsewhere in Canada, but that was not the case around the time of the first free trade agreement. And so there's been great investment on the part of provincial governments and the federal government in order to make this sector a real national success by any standard. National parks is one that came up from a lot of people. And again, national parks have been around for quite a while, since not long after the country was founded. And early on, there were just a handful of parks that were put in place. But now we have 38 national parks, 10 preserves, 5 marine areas, and a plethora of national historic sites. Canadian airport authorities are entities that we take for granted, but we didn't have airport authorities at the end of the 1980s. In fact, infrastructure funding for airports was in dire straits. The government had a huge deficit at the national level there, and Transport Canada really had a problem on its hands. So the government around that time decided to take a very innovative approach and find a new way, and a very Canadian way, to develop airport authorities that did not involve outright privatization, but devolution to community-based entities that then had in effect a fee-based model that permitted investment from outsiders into the infrastructure. And one result of that is, until COVID hit, $400 million per year was going to the government of Canada. There were not outlays going from the government of Canada, and there's $32 billion of infrastructure development over a great number of years. And then very briefly, Insite in Vancouver. Many of us take this for granted now. The first supervised injection site opened in 2003, but that was a product of a couple decades of lobbying, a political career lost by the mayor of Vancouver, and then the next mayor put the first supervised injection site in place. A lot of that relied on a fortuitous alignment between a provincial government that was willing to support the city of Vancouver, and a federal government that was willing to grant a temporary exemption to such a site. But then there were a series of challenges and to that, and the grassroots coalition that had fought for these sites then had to go to the Supreme Court and ensure that this could continue. So all of these successes have been contentious, had headwinds, and also had to confront evolving environments. So today we're going to, rather than dwell on those cases, actually turn to our guest today, Lisa Helps, the former mayor of my city of Vancouver, or sorry, Victoria, and now currently just been named as housing advisor to the BC Minister of Housing. Sorry, that's not the Minister of Health there on that slide. George Abbott, who is a former minister of many portfolios, and now a UVic adjunct faculty member after a successful consulting career on many important files. Michael Prince, a colleague at the University of Victoria, who's the Lansdowne Professor of Social Policy and a well-known commentator in our community. And finally, Kim Spears, President of IPAC Victoria, and also a colleague at the School of Public Administration. So let's begin in the order that's presented on the slide here. What do you consider to be an example of policy success on Vancouver Island or in British Columbia, and possibly Canada more generally? So over to you, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Everett. Good afternoon, everyone. Lisa Helps here. And as Everett noted, we're here on the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking people. And in the city of Victoria, that's specifically the Songhees and the Esquimalt Nations. I could talk about two different examples, and I think I'm going to focus my remarks at the beginning anyways on the building of our bike network here in the city of Victoria. And if there's interest in the second round, I can talk about the Regional Housing First program. I think that's also a key policy success. But I'm going to go with the bike lanes because it was arguably more contentious than the housing, although the housing wasn't uncontentious either. And I think that's the first point that I'll make. And Everett already made this point indeed, that policy successes often start off as controversial ideas and don't necessarily have public support at the outset. And I think there are two reasons for that. And this was certainly the case with our bike network. The first is, in some cases, it's because it's too big of an idea or too innovative an idea for the general public, and for that matter, sometimes the media to get their heads around. And sometimes it's a communication problem, but sometimes it's just a big new idea. The other thing I think that that's important to consider in terms of policy successes not being supported right at the outset is oftentimes, I would say, the best policy successes or the best public policy is from the very outset taking a long-term view. And when people are going about their daily lives, getting their kids to soccer and dinner on the table, they're not necessarily taking that long-term view. So they may not understand it or care. And so those are some of the reasons, I think, at the outset why there isn't broad public support for something that, down the road, once it's implemented, there is. So with our bike network, we wanted to create an all ages and abilities cycling network, 32 kilometers and growing. And the purpose of it was really to connect people safely and easily from their neighborhoods into the downtown, to connect neighborhoods together, to get people to schools and community centers and parks and all of those community amenities safely and accessibly without having to get into a car. And in terms of people who do need to drive, the objective was aimed somewhat at them as well, because if you're getting people who currently don't want to be driving but don't feel safe biking next to cars out of their cars, it creates more road space, and particularly, and this is what we found to be true, more parking spaces in the downtown and elsewhere for people who actually do need to drive. So that was the objective, to get people to move more safely, more easily, more healthily from place to place in the city. I think the other key point in terms of the second principle, and I touched on this already, is that it's difficult sometimes to achieve policy success and to have that long-term view when we're working in short-term political cycles. And what that requires and what that required with the building of our bike network was continued focus on the issue. And in the early stages, and again, Everett mentioned this, deep engagement with the public to understand what they needed this network to do, particularly with business owners who didn't want to lose parking in front of their stores and so on. And so in the initial stages of the development, which began in 2016, we did really deep, broad public engagement, corridor by corridor, in some cases, parking spot by parking spot, tree by tree, to figure out what is it that was needed. And then we built the lanes in consideration, built the corridors in consideration and in response to the public feedback. And shop owners and restaurant owners could see, okay, I got to keep my parking spot, or those 5 trees were removed, but 10 new trees were planted. And so that was part of the key to the success along the way, is deep listening, responsiveness, and then building the network based on what people actually told us that they wanted. I think moving on from there, once we got to future corridors, we didn't do that same deep level of engagement. And I think that that's fine, because we learned from the first few. And if you want to have a policy success, you actually need to implement. You can't just talk forever, because of course, when it's a controversial project like the bike lanes were, you need to prove the concept. I think third point to make is the importance in a policy success of having a small dedicated group of people who are going to carry on and carry the vision, in some cases, no matter what the pushback is in those initial and shorter term stages. So we had an amazing dedicated group of staff at the city who kept their heads down and kept working, developing the next corridor and the next corridor, and then getting them built. And then while the votes did fall away as it got more controversial, we never lost more. So our Victoria City Council had 9 members, and we never got down lower than 6. And of course, you need 5 votes to get anything done. We never got down lower than 6 on approving corridor after corridor. So we had that resolve to keep going despite some pretty big pushback. And I think Michael was probably asked to comment on it maybe sometimes here in the Victoria media. And then finally, I would say, and again, just in this short time that we have, another key to developing a policy success is knowing when you've been successful. When have you hit that tipping point? And then when can you kind of stop pushing so hard because the public has embraced it? And for us, I would say that came in the summer of 2021. So we had started building the bike network in 2017. Consultation began the year before. And in August 2021, there was a front page newspaper story in the Times Colonist, our daily paper, with people talking about how much they love the bike network. There were parents with kids that could take their kids to school safely. There were people who weren't spending so much money on gas. I was not quoted in the article. No one from the city was quoted in the article. And it was really, I think, a tipping point. And then from that point on, it's a network that's been embraced and heavily used by the public. So our policy objective was achieved, yeah, happy to talk more about that or housing when it's time to go to the second round. Thanks, Everett.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Lisa. And I really like the way that you illustrated those principles. And I must say, for example, in the local airport authorities case, the team that was put together to drive those 22 airport authorities was consisted of only 4 or 5 people from Transport Canada. And the team was created in order to basically circumvent the traditional expertise of Transport Canada. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that. And now we'll turn to George. Welcome, George.
Well, thanks very much, Everett. I think I've remembered to unmute myself for a change. I also am joining the discussion today from Greater Victoria, the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and the Songhees, and appreciative of that. My example I'll be offering up today, Everett, is the BC Teachers Council, which was created in 2011. I had the honor of spending 35 years in politics, about half in local government, half in the provincial government. And I think it probably equipped me better to detect policy failures than policy successes. But I think this council is a success. And I'm just giving some thought to why I consider it a success. It's fairly consistent with what you said at the outset, the parameters of success. Among them, I think there are two key and a third that's a kind of bonus. First is enables improvements in processes and outcomes for at least some portion of the public. I think that's an essential part of policy success. And secondly, proves durable beyond changes of government and continues to hold the respect of the public across time. I think that, again, is a very important dimension to policy success. The third, and it's a bonus if we can achieve it, the policy initiative is the product of an inclusive consultative process, including competing and dissenting voices. And so, if it can survive despite that, I think that's a good indication that it is a success. So my story comes from my tenure as Minister of Education from 2011 to 2013. As a newly minted Minister of Education early in 2011. I had a report immediately on my desk, which was a scathing review of the BC Teachers College, and in particular, a scathing assessment of the disciplinary panels that were a part of the college. The report is still on the World Wide Net. It's authored by Don Avison, who's a much respected former deputy minister in government. Obviously, as a new Minister of Education, one of the things that I had hoped to build was a better relationship with the BC Teachers Federation. That relationship had been deeply troubled under my predecessors and often was quite toxic. And I wanted to see some improvement on that. Acting immediately on the recommendations in the Avison report, A College Divided was its title. It would not have been conducive to productive relationship, but it was also a very difficult political issue because the report had been released publicly. It was the subject of front page headlines in the Vancouver Sun and many other publications in British Columbia. There was obviously some expectation that the new Minister of Education was going to do something about it. So our options, I would say, at the time were of the pick your poison variety. I did not want to immediately embrace the recommendations, nor did I want to dismiss them in any kind of immediate sense. The decision we took, and I believe it was the right one, was to promise our serious consideration of the recommendations, but to engage all of our education partners in a discussion of where do we go from here. Those partners included not only the Teachers Federation, but the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils, who were very vocal in their criticism of the disciplinary panels, BC School Trustees Association, principals and vice principals, superintendents, and so on. So there was lots of partners and lots of work to do. The biggest step for the purposes of today's discussion was for the Ministry of Education, including the minister, to take a deep dive into the prevailing statute, which was the Teaching Professions Act, look at how it was working, what was important to government, what was important to the Teachers Federation, and so on, to our partners. The deconstruction that was undertaken by the ministry involved looking at components like the composition of the college board, the mode of election or appointment to the board, the college's control over curriculum development, teacher certification, and the one that had initiated the problems, the disciplinary panels. Our kind of blue sky discussion within the ministry also extended to, what are the elements here that are really important to our partners? What are the ones that are important to government? Within the ministry, policy analysts and others work doggedly to look at national and international policy lessons that we might draw on, and policy transfers that might support a new model that would provide more defensible disciplinary panels and other processes than had been the case under the BC College of Teachers. What ultimately flowed from all of that work was legislation creating a BC Teachers Council. We drew on processes and policies from other provinces, from Scotland notably as well, and the title itself was one that was borrowed from New Zealand, where effectively their college, their council had that kind of name to it. So one of the things also that I did as a minister, and I think proved to be very wise in the long term, was extensive discussion, not only with the BC Teachers Federation, which is about 30 hours cumulatively, and all our partners, as well as with the opposition, the NDP opposition's education critic. I spent a lot of time with him, and happily, at least from my perspective, the result of that work was unanimous support in the legislature for the new act and the new BC Teachers Council model. It has been sustained across time, is no longer the object of concern and criticism, and to me, Everett, that helps to constitute it as a policy success. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you very much, George. And now we'll move to Mike Prince. Mike. Oh, we can't hear you, Mike.
There we go. Okay, thank
Good.
you. I'm going to take us up to the national level. It's been nice to hear about local and provincial, and I'm going to look at a federal social policy initiative that I would suggest has been very successful. But it's not one that's covered in the book. The book has 3 or 4 really good chapters on looking at other social policies in Canada, nationally and elsewhere, and other levels. So this kind of complements, I think, some of the analysis or presentations that are contained in the book. So a plug for the book. So this is to look at the introduction and implementation of the Canada Child Benefit, which was introduced in 2016. Just to back up a bit, this was an idea that came from the Liberal Party of Canada, which had been in opposition for about 10 years, leading up to the 2015 general election in Canada that year. And in preparation for that election campaign, the Liberals looked, as they have in other times in their history when they've been in the opposition wilderness, looked at reflecting on social policy. And one of their keystone ideas in their platform running into the 2015 election was to do a major realignment of existing child and family benefits delivered at the federal level, and to introduce a new more targeted benefit called the Canada Child Benefit. Just to remind people, there had been introduced by the previous Conservative government of Stephen Harper a program called the Universal Child Care Benefit, which was universal, but it had really nothing to do with childcare because it was a cash payment, which people could use for anything, although the government of the day had noted it to be around childcare per se. So the Liberals ran on a campaign in 2015 that they were going to eliminate the universal childcare benefit, as well as a couple of other programs, and bring in a new, more targeted but more generous income support program for families with children under the age of 18. So they won that election. They formed government in November, and by the next June, the new program was rolling out benefits, which was quite a success story in terms of. And part of the reason for that was this is fairly unusual nowadays. is that the political party itself had done a lot of homework and had consulted with experts, academics, social policy advocates, key stakeholders in the child and family community and in the poverty community. And so they had a pretty robust program design in mind when they were running in the election in 2015. And so when they came to office in late 2015 and into early 2016, this could literally be rolled into the very first budget that was brought in by then Finance Minister Bill Marneau, and the first benefits started to roll out that summer. So in terms of programmatic and process success, I would say that the big points on that. The Liberals were lucky that they were in third place when they went into the election, and they came out with a majority government, unheard of in Canadian federal politics. So you had a government that actually could control Parliament quite readily, and the benefit was introduced, replacing 3 existing programs. And an interesting side feature here is that there wasn't any great political costs to the governing party in canceling 3 existing programs, because they were immediately replacing them with a single, much more improved, much more generous program. And it generates greater benefits for 9 out of 10 Canadian families. So there weren't a lot of losers that were created out of this policy initiative. If you'd say there were losers, there were people at high income levels of over $200,000 a year or more. So it wasn't a widespread middle class that was getting squeezed. In fact, the middle class was actually going to benefit more as we're low income. So this got implemented in 2016. Then the case about success I want to make, or the point I want to make about success, is other congenial environmental factors that go on to support the initiative that you're focused on. And in this case, the Canada Child Benefit. When it was first introduced in 2016, it was not indexed to inflation. And there was some criticism for that. And the government said, well, we are going to index it, but we won't for 4 years, because we want to kind of phase it in. It's a new major program. It was originally around $25 billion a year as a cash benefit and was going to grow. So there was some caution there. But after 2 years, they decided to index it fully to inflation, not only the maximum benefit amount, but also the income threshold, so that it ensured that a stable group of Canadians would qualify for it. And in today's environment in 2022, late 2022, early 2023, of inflation rising again, you see this as quite a significant decision that was taken back in 2018 to inflation-proof the program, as are basically all federal income programs. The government also brought in, a year or two later, the Poverty Reduction Strategy, and they passed the Poverty Reduction Act of 2019. And with that was the introduction of Canada's first official poverty line, using the market basket measure to define that. And that allowed to hook the Canada Child Benefit to the aspirations of poverty reduction, with goals in 2020 and goals out to 2030. So you start to get an architecture here around the program of a mechanism for monitoring results and setting targets that were aspirational. And I would say the program has performed quite well in terms of programmatic success. Since the program has been launched, there's been a reduction in poverty. 435,000 families with children are out of poverty that were in poverty in 2015. So this program has had a massive impact. You might have seen in the press in the last couple of days, poverty reports coming out here in BC and in other provinces around Campaign 2000 or other poverty reports that showed reduction in poverty. Here in BC in particular, very notable success. A good chunk of that is to do with the COVID emergency funding, but a big core of that is the Canada Child Benefit, which has been a massive new injection of funding. So it's been successful for poverty reduction. It's also been successful facing some unexpected challenges with the global pandemic. It actually provided much needed economic stability for families and households. It was an existing major service delivery mechanism that allowed the federal government to flow out to over 4 million Canadian families a one-time additional benefit to do with affordability inflation pressures last year, where an additional $1,000 per child per year was flowed out for a one-time payment, again, of several $billion. So it allowed the government of Canada to have an instrument there to respond very quickly. Just last thing, which something George touched on as well, is the durability or the future of this program. You would think that you could just assume that this is going to continue well on into the future. It may well be. I think the true test will be that when there's a change in government, the next time the Conservatives take office in Ottawa will be to see whether this program survives in its current form or gets reformed. This is a policy area, child and family income benefits, that over the last 70 or 80 years has had various major changes. Some programs don't last that long. The universal child care benefit, it was brought in around 2011. It was gone by 2016. This is a field known for some turbulence. So the only difference I would add here is this is a program, though, on a scale that we have not seen ever for income support to Canadians with families. This will soon be this is larger than the employment insurance program. This is over twice the size of the Department of Defense's total budget. This is a massive income security program, only dwarfed by old age security and guaranteed income supplement for seniors. And if we think of that, which is a chapter in the book, by the way, on OAS, that's been around now for 70 years. And it's one that's very popular with politicians of all political stripes and very popular with the public. And certainly an aging population, it's very popular with. So we might see a similar political dynamic and public dynamic of support grow around the Canada Child Benefit. So I'll leave it there and thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel.
Hey, great. Thank you, Mike. And I'm sure that actually Lisa and George were identifying with some of the criteria that you also put in place there. So we're going to turn to Kim Spears. Kim, you're going to have to put your running shoes on, and I'll do the stop share so you can put up your PowerPoint slide.
Okay, great. And I'll just
And while we're doing that, we may be a little time challenged here, but if there's anyone in the audience that has an example they'd like to share or a question, then put it in, and we'll try to tend to that. We'll have a lightning round after Kim's presentation with the panel. Okay, Kim?
Okay, thanks so much. Well, someone has to do a PowerPoint presentation, so here I am. I just want to say I had a really, what I would say, a good problem in terms of just having to make a choice, because I was trying to figure out, well, what policy will I focus on? And what I think are policy successes could be the official community plans in BC, economic development policy in the regions, such as Western economic diversification. I think a policy success is getting rid of like both a smoking and non-smoking section in restaurants and airplanes. There's been lots of successes, I think, with BC road safety related to distracted driving. There's been improvements related to driving under the influence in terms of people not being charged, or just reductions in terms of people being charged. Same with speeding. And I was just thinking this morning, gosh, I should have focused on policies related to consumer protection. But no, I'm going to focus on what I think is one of the most successful policies in Canada. And this one comes out of Alberta. Now, I had no idea this policy existed until I moved to Alberta. I moved from Ontario. I actually thought my colleagues were punking me when they said that there was a rat control policy. I didn't believe them until I went home and looked it up on the internet. So this is what I'm focusing on. So just in terms of that initial problem, well, rats were moving westward, and they reached that Saskatchewan-Alberta border back in 1950. And it was deemed to be a serious problem by the government of Alberta because there was losses to foodstuff. And at that point in time, Alberta was, and still is, an agricultural province, relies heavily on that industry. And just a recent stat, just in terms of demonstrating the problem, mice and rats are estimated to cause nearly $20 billion in damage and wipe out as much as 1/5 of the world's food supply. There's also damage caused by gnawing, tunneling, and urinating, and also disease transmission. So government of Alberta, they wanted to address this problem and develop various policy instruments. Now, this person on the left-hand side is indeed part of the rat control who walks along the border and monitors for rats. There's again, variety of policy instruments. There's an 8-person team, there are pest control inspectors, and there is daily monitoring along the border. They use poison and shotguns, as you see. So there's that extermination approach. There's also a public support and education policy instrument. So it's educating the public on trying to prevent rats, trying to just encourage or discourage growth. And just the way they've messaged this as well, it's everyone's problem and everyone is part of the solution as well. Important to note as well, just another policy instrument, it's illegal to import and sell rats. There's no pet rats, and indeed there's a fine of $4,000 if you have a pet rat. Zoos and universities and colleges are allowed rats. And just for property holders, there's lots of warnings, fines, and court actions, but there's been very few court actions for decades, simply because there's buy-in and support of this initiative. So here's just an example of some of the education posters out there as well. And these posters started in the 1950s and they're still out there. Just in terms of evidence of success, well, Alberta is known as the most rat-free jurisdiction in the world. And just on their government of Alberta's website, they note, due to the rat patrol's vigilance, our province has saved an estimated $1 billion over 50 years in property damage, livestock losses, human suffering and healthcare, as well as lost and contaminated food. And then since 1959, there's been usually only 1 to 5 rat infestations per year. And when there is an infestation, it's big news in Alberta. And just a stat, in 2020, 17 rats were found. And just in terms of, I thought another indicator for evidence of success is that they're still really vigilant about maintaining those low numbers. So right now there's a trend for rats to be hitchhikers. They're saying they're coming from BC. So it's a different education campaign now in terms of warning people to look in their campers or cars for rats before they before they enter Alberta from BC. So just quickly, some reasons for success. The goals are very clear. Sometimes goals aren't always clear, so it's difficult to determine what success can look like. So the goal is eradicate rats in Alberta. Also, another reason for success is the geography and distribution of people. It's a relatively small area to patrol. Thank goodness for the mountains on the west, because rats do not like mountains. So the rat patrol is focused on the Saskatchewan border. They don't like cold weather as well. So again, the size of the infested area is small. There was also a quick response to the new problem as well. So the rat control program was initiated as soon as the rats entered the province back in 1950. And in one sense, they were lucky as well, because there was legislation already in place to support this response to the problem. There's also shared goals and delegated service implementation. So the province is involved in this. The municipalities are very supportive. 7 municipalities along the border are primarily responsible for implementation, and they also work with pest control folks as well. There was also the availability of pesticides that, and this is, I guess, arguable, you know, which are relatively safe for humans, but very effective against rats. And these were made available soon after rats entered the province. I think the messaging and timing also played a part in terms of leading to the success of this policy. You know, shortly after the war, 1950, the messaging from the government was still built on that wartime language. The public was eager to fight an alien menace, and that's how the messaging was portrayed on the posters. And interesting, New Zealand, they have, they're also focusing on getting rid of their rats as well. The messaging, though, draws on love of local wildlife and the natural world. So, you know, what may work in one jurisdiction may not necessarily work in another. Just getting near the end here, just another reason for this success is efficiency and alignment. The program costs approximately, you know, just almost $400,000 a year, and that's mostly in salaries, but it saves Alberta's farmers millions. And I think also what helps as well is in terms of alignment, Saskatchewan also developed a rat control program in 1963. So there are now less rats going into Alberta as well. Now, Everett, what I did is I looked at that PPE success framework, and I give this policy 4 stars. It has public value. There's been the achievement of goals. It says, you know, one of the indicators, pleasure and pain are equally distributed, except for the rats. I think they feel the most pain. Also, there's a range of policy instruments. It's provincially funded. There's low resources. Implementation works. Political success. Many winners. Maybe everybody's a winner, except you know, except the rats. And there's wide support. Politicians of all stripes. It doesn't matter, you know, what political party. And success over time, similar to what you mentioned, you know, 70 years, Michael, you know, here we have another 70-year policy success as well.
Okay, so Kim, I'm going to have to stop you there because then I will not be called a successful facilitator today.
And I'm
so,
done.
By the time you got to the end of your presentation, I thought, beat that, Mike, beat that. Given the time, there's been some chat activity, of course, around the bike lanes. I would just like to go around the panel right now and just have each of you kind of reflect for a minute or so on what you've heard from others. I've made a list of all the really interesting points that you've made, but Lisa, let's go back to you.
Well, I think, I mean, there's a lot of similarities from rats to the child benefit to the Teachers Council. And I think the key, and, you know, this is what I heard and also what I know from experience, is that there needs to be real focus. Policy successes don't come from unfocused kind of flailing around. They come from focus, whether it's, you know, those 8 people who are sent out to deliver the rats, or the work that George did as minister to say, this is the direction we're going to need to go based on Dawn's report. So focus is really key. And I think that's something that comes out for me from all the presentations here.
Great, thank you. George.
Well, thanks. I think one of the common themes that I heard was around durability as a measure of policy success, and what I've heard from fellow panelists would certainly support that. You know, one of the things I came away from my years in provincial government wishing was that I had some of the experience that I gained as a doctoral student at the University of Victoria as a getting older man, but I would have loved to have had a better understanding of how policy learnings and policy transfer can be brought into play. And I think, you know, particularly when I think about the challenges that the Ministry of Health is facing in British Columbia. In fact, every Ministry of Health all across Canada and probably across the world is facing post-pandemic. It is an occasion when we need much greater use of policy learning and policy transfer. So those are kind of my thoughts coming out. I love the examples, and I think all of them are really effective in making some very important points about policy development and how to sustain policy across time.
Great. Thank you, George. Mike?
Yeah, rich conversations across different jurisdictions, different levels. I didn't anticipate we'd be talking about rats this afternoon, but that was a wonderful case study. And I was just enjoying watching George smile as as Kim was laying out the political case for this policy initiative. And, well, there were some losers, I guess the rats, but in terms of pain. Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I just want to go back to your opening remarks, Everett, about this felt need to respond to the discourse in anticipation of today's panel. I couldn't help but notice in the Globe and Mail over the last 5 to 10 days about 7 examples of why your group came together in the first place to write this book to celebrate successes. I mean, whether it's the lead editorials of the Globe, Andrew Coyne's columns about the failure of governments, things are broken, things aren't done well. There's a really kind of brewing anti-public service discourse that's quite distressing. And so that's what I took away was when I first got invited, I don't know, a month or two ago when you pitched the idea, I thought, yeah, okay. But then I started to pay a little more attention to the news from this perspective. And I thought, yeah, I can see why people in IPAC and other groups committed to peace, order, and good government. There's some very disturbing conversations and portrayals and stereotyping that's going on. I mean, in one sense, and Lisa will know this, and George better than I do, as politicians or former. I mean, it's always out there, and it's always been out there. Maybe it's been more intensified now. Maybe it's more vitriolic. Maybe it's more immediate through social media. But without wanting to be just cheerleaders for the state, I think there is a role for these sort of thoughtful analyses of case studies and acknowledging. My last point would be success is always somewhat in the eye of the beholder. There'll always be someone who'll say, "Well, I disagree," and that's fine. That's part of the democratic discourse, as you said. So. So my main takeaway from this panel is this was very timely. This was very necessary. And I hope the listeners got to appreciate that across 4 very different case studies, there's a lot of empirical evidence out there to suggest, that there's well-meaning politicians, well-meaning public servants, well-meaning stakeholders who want to collaborate together to tackle real problems facing Canadians.
Great. Thank you for that, Mike. Kim, a couple last words.
Yeah, just a few. Lisa, I really appreciated, and all of you referred to just that, the politicians and policy actors just being courageous and developing long-term planning, because just the election cycle doesn't work for you in that regard. So I've just really appreciated a lot of people, who on this panel and their work in that long-term visioning. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. And it's that reliance as well on the various policy actors and, who IPAC represents are the civil servants. And providing evidence-based policy options, recommendations to the political decision makers. I just want to do, a shout out to them because they are the futuristic thinkers as well. So I just want to say one last thing, because I know when I was in government and as a consultant, we did lots of best practices. So I'll just say, don't just rely on SmartWise promising practices. What may work in another jurisdiction in terms of a policy success may not necessarily work in your own. You need to fully understand your own policy environment. And you can't just copy and paste a policy, say, from Saskatchewan into BC, as probably many of you are well aware. So that's it from me.
Great, thank you, Kim. Yeah, I think you've done an excellent job doing a roll up on the various points that had been made. I was quite struck by the idea of that Mike had about not only part of durability is also having complementary policy frameworks, and I think when we think about that, you could apply it to a lot of different domains. The idea of policies. There are lots of policies that do get initiated and never get bedded down. And so that notion of durability and vigilance, it's not just, putting the policy in place, it's also really making it go after that. And often the teams who design policies leave. And so there's a handoff that has to occur. And then both political and administrative monitoring of progress. I think another theme that was there that was touched upon that wasn't done in the roll up here was this idea of kind of phasing in the policy, even if it's bold, and building momentum and learning as you go. I think that's often a very common approach. Getting a very good team that will persevere and focus. And then another one that came up is this idea that there's emulation. That often if something is done well, then other jurisdictions start to pick up on it, just as often our jurisdictions or a policy success exemplar has learned from other jurisdictions as well. Well, look, I think we should end this right now. And what I would like to do is, first of all, thank the audience for participating today. And then, of course, our panelists. Lisa Helps, we know you're very busy, and so thank you for making the time. George, it's good to see you again. Mike, thank you for writing another chapter in the book. We'll just have to add what you described there. And Kim, as always, thank you for a really innovative example and also being president of IPAC Victoria. I'm just going to close by making a pitch for the Institute of Public Administration of Canada and the team there, David, but especially Aaron Bellwood today for facilitating this event, and also for IPAC Victoria. I'm on the board of IPAC Victoria, and do stay in touch and listen for our next events. And if you're not a member of IPAC, then do join and get your ideas for the next event. If you want to dip into that book, it's an open access book with Oxford University Press. So if you put in the title Policy Success in Canada, you will be able to download particular chapters and for free. So there you go. That's as good as it gets. So I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. And I hope the rest of the week goes well for you all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fine.